I did want to start with a couple bios on our panelists. Damon's going to go first. He's actually going to do a presentation here with a couple slides, some really cool data, and then we'll get into the panel. Like Teresa mentioned, we have some preset questions, but it's definitely open. Feel free to ask questions. We'll pass you the microphone. Just super casual forum environment. So Damon Runberg, so he's the state economist. He's with Business Oregon. He supports the statewide economic development goals by tracking and analyzing economic indicators critical to Oregon's workers and businesses. He also evaluates the effectiveness of Oregon's economic development strategies and incentives. Prior to working with Business Oregon, Damon was the regional economist with the Oregon Employment Department for the East Cascades of Oregon for nearly 13 years. So he's presented before for the Bend Chamber of Commerce, so you might have seen him. He's pretty awesome, so knows his stuff. In the middle, we have Jordan Dolly. So he is with Jones & Ross, CPA and Business Advisors. He's a senior manager and is a key member of the firm's healthcare and dental teams. He supports owners of medical and dental practices who are looking to make the most of their opportunity. He specializes in practice benchmarking, cash flow planning, business strategy, tax planning, and navigating practice transitions. As a Bend native, Jordan is passionate about making a positive impact on the local business community, and he currently serves as the audit chair of the local chapter of Risk Management Association. So, as bankers are familiar with RMA, I'm on the board with Jordan. So it's a banking thing. And then last but not least, we have Scott Beard, who is the director of Columbia Healthcare Banking. He has been in banking for over 30 years with more than 25 years in healthcare lending. His team does healthcare lending and banking in all 50 states. So our team has two divisions. We have a regional team, which covers Oregon, Washington, Idaho. And then we have a national team, which covers all other states. So we truly are in many states and areas. He is a graduate of Oregon State University, go Beavers, and has completed the banking program from Pacific Coast Banking School. In his spare time, he likes golfing and spending time in outdoors. So that is our panel. Right, you want to go?
Yeah.
Bring up your
do I
presentation.
have a little clicker or?
You do.
Oh, I might click then and not stand behind the podium.
All right, let me pull it up.
Look at that. Hey everyone, how are we doing this evening? Doing well? It's been a day for me. This is my third talk of the day, but you are the best group because I get to drink a glass of wine while I'm talking. And it's okay for a state economist to come up here and drink a glass of wine in front of you because the food and beverage sector is one of our targeted industry sectors. So in this case, I'm promoting our wonderful Pinot Noirs that come from the Willamette Valley, and some of you maybe are hopefully drinking one of our craft beers that come from here in Bend. I am a Bend local as well, so I live down the street, in fact. So it's kind of nice to just walk over here. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing in healthcare here in the high desert specifically. I tend to have more of a statewide perspective when we're talking about things, but I live here. I used to be the regional economist for Central Oregon, and you guys care about what's going on in Central Oregon. So we're going to zoom in on some of the trends we're seeing in healthcare and the trends that I think will be affecting healthcare over the next 10, 15 years or so. And hopefully that sort of sets the stage for the conversation that we're going to have for the rest of the evening, but we have time together. So with that, if you want to see some mind-blowing numbers, look at the healthcare growth that we've seen in Central Oregon over the last 10 years. This here on the left, 50%. That is the number of jobs we've expanded in the healthcare sector from 2013 to 2023 in Central Oregon. That includes the three counties, Kirk, Deschutes, and Jefferson. Obviously, Deschutes is the elephant in the room here and accounts for the vast majority of the jobs, mostly in Bend and Redmond. 50% growth. I mean, that is massive. And you all probably don't look at growth rates at other economies or other industries. I'm just telling you that's a huge growth rate, okay? That's the industry that you all represent. If we look at what the economy did as a whole, though, it is also kind of mind-boggling. Like 40% growth in Central Oregon in a 10-year period of time. It is important to sort of rewind our brains a little bit back 10 years ago. I know this is hard to do, but like 2013, we were still pretty ho-hum here in Central Oregon. It was a devastating recession that we had just come out of, the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Central Oregon was devastated by that. So our growth rate number is a little bit deceptive because this is not capturing the recovery that we were still experiencing at that time. That's not all just expansion there. But then we compare all that growth in jobs that we've seen to the population growth. We far surpassed the growth in population. 25%. But once again, I know you all don't look at population growth rate numbers daily, but 25% growth in a population base over a 10-year period of time is off the charts. In fact, our sort of tri-county area, we're either ranked as the second or somewhere between the second to third fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States over the last 10 years. So that number is a big number, and it's like off the charts to the point that we're amongst the fastest in the nation. But you might be sort of saying to yourself, like, this is crazy to see sort of the job numbers so far in excess of population. Some of that, like I said, is being held in check by the fact that we're still recovering from that last recession, from the base period we're talking about here. But another thing that we sort of need to think about when we're talking about trends in the healthcare sector is this concept of discretionary versus non-discretionary spending that happens in the economy. So on the discretionary side, we all can decide to go up to Mount Bachelor and go for a hike, or this is Todd Lake specifically here. You can go to Todd Lake and go walk around it in a few days. I think they actually opened the highway already. You can go do that. By the way, the old snow cover, so be ready for it. But you could go for a hike. But if you trip while you're walking around Todd Lake and you break your arm, then what do you got to do? You got to go see the doctor. You got to go to the urgent care. You got to go to the emergency department. You got to go see your primary care physician, whatever it might be. That's a non-discretionary expense. We have discretionary, which are things we choose to spend money on, and we have non-discretionary expenses, things we choose not to. Oh, I don't say we're still making a choice. Things we don't really have much of a choice on spending. And healthcare largely falls under this I broke my arm situation and I've got to go do this thing, with the exception of cosmetic surgeries perhaps, which are more aesthetic, I guess, mostly non-discretionary. So what does that mean for us? For the most part, that means that healthcare jobs and employment is driven by people. The number of people that you have in your communities is a big factor there. But another component that we know about healthcare is not just the number of people, but the composition of the people that are in your community. So the older your population is, a disproportionate share of those folks are going to be using health services, right? Because older folks need health services at a higher rate than, 20-somethings or whatever. So we see this sort of trend that's happening. So we have this fast growth in Central Oregon, and we also, in a second here, let's look at the demographics to see where the growth is actually coming from. Oh, we're not doing the demographics yet. We'll get to that next. Some of you have offices probably, or planning on offices in different parts of Central Oregon. What we have here is we're sort of seeing where is the population growth? If we know that we have largely a non-discretionary industry, then you're basically trying to chase where the people are and where the people are going to be going, right? That's sort of the idea behind this. And Central Oregon is fascinating. I mean, we all know that Bend is sort of the elephant in the room, but we fully appreciate how much Bend is an elephant in the room here when we actually look at the raw number of people who live in Bend compared to the rest of the region. What we have on the left of each of these bars for the cities is the 2022 population numbers, and then we go through, we start getting into forecasts by Portland State University. So as we move to the right on each of these, I think I have the laser, you can see the orange is a forecast for 2025, and you can go all the way to 2040 as the pink. And moral of the story, the growth in Bend is not expected to stop anytime soon. So if you're worried, do I expand that business or not, because I'm worried that people are gonna stop moving here, most of the forecasts that are out there are pretty bullish that growth is gonna continue here in Bend. We also see projections of phenomenal growth in Redmond as well. The raw numbers don't look as impressive, but the rate of growth is actually higher for Redmond projected by Portland State University than it is for Bend specifically. But you look at the rest of Central Oregon, it doesn't look nearly as exciting as you would hope, right? I mean, they still, once again, these are raw values here. But it is important to note that some of our Prineville parts of Kirk County are expected to have really fast growth rates. Same with Madras, and Sisters in particular are also expected to have some really fast growth rates. Once again, the rate of growth, but you're coming off relatively low population, so a little easier to have fast growth rates. But moral of the story here is, if we have a non-discretionary industry, the people who do population and demographic forecasting are saying this is going to continue to be growth communities over the long run, and that bodes well for these non-discretionary industries. This is the demographic component that I was talking about here. If we can actually look and see where the growth is happening by population age. So where are we seeing the types of folks that will be both moving here, and then people also age into these different categories too, right? You're never 25 for life, although I had a friend who was always like, every time he turned his next birthday, he was like, 22 still feels great. That's not how it works for the rest of us. A 60 or a 74-year-old will eventually turn into a 75-plus-year-old in this category here. It's interesting to see some of the trends that we see here, because once again, for most healthcare folks, we really care about that older population because they're disproportionately demanding these health services. Yeah, question.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So in 2010, were these projections, like what were the projections in 2010? If you know, if you don't know, it's okay. I'm just wondering, in 10, 11, 12,
Yeah,
are
how
we
accurate?
projecting this type of exponential growth?
Yeah, they missed the mark. We grew faster.
Okay.
Over the last decade, we grew faster than the original projections were for us.
So you just think the numbers now are easier to track, or?
Well, I mean, these are all forecast numbers for the most part. So this is all future stuff. Nothing is guaranteed here. This is just giving you insight into what they think, they as in our population research center for the state, thinks population is going to look like here in Central Oregon. Their history is pretty great at being conservative on the estimates for us. I will say that we have, since their forecast came out in 2022, and it is now 2024, so we have a year of insight into how close they are tracking with this. Our annualized growth rate in 2023 was far lower than they had expected based on this original forecast. So maybe their history being conservative, maybe they were now, they flipped that and they're being overly optimistic, it's hard to say. But we have some serious housing constraints and housing affordability constraints in Central Oregon, and that is definitely a headwind for population growth right now. And so maybe we work that out, but over the long run, the expectation is still a major growth community. And are we going to see a 25% growth rate in our population over this next 10 years? Probably not. Like, that's very much not in the cards from the history that we just had. But for the most part, you see pretty strong growth across most demographic groups, but it's really hard to read on this graph exactly what's going on and parsing it out by group. So I actually indexed it for us. An index is just so they can look at the relative change for each of these different demographic groups, and then you really get to see the trend here. So where is the fastest growth that we're supposed to be seeing? It's boomers. It's boomers growth. It's folks who are baby boomers aging into that 75-year-old and older category, and that growth really accelerates there over the next 4 or 5 years. We see actually pretty awesome growth from our millennials. Millennials are the 40 to 54-year-olds there. I know it's crazy to say that, but millennials are 44 now. They have kids in high school. Okay? Some millennials are younger than that, but I'm just saying the oldest ones are 44 and have kids in high school. So just a reminder out there that it's when we're talking about demographic groups here. And encouragingly, we see this actually pretty sizable growth in the 20 to 39 category. Many of you are employers, right? Raise your hand if you employ people. You almost all do, right? That's not a business. One of the biggest fears we have going forward over the next 10, 15 years is this demographic crunch. Where are we going to find the workers of tomorrow? And without population growth rate in some parts of the state, this is a major crisis. Now, Central Oregon's lucky because we have been drawing people in and continue to do that, so we can answer some of these workforce challenges by the fact that we're an attractive place to move. And once again, Portland State University says those sort of prime working age folks are continuing to move here. So that's an encouraging trend for us long term. One that's not particularly encouraging is, you see this line that's right on the dotted line, the 0 to 19. That's our youth population. Over the next 15 years or so, Portland State thinks that our youth population is not going to change at all from what it is today. We have peaked as far as young people. And we've seen that a little bit on the enrollment numbers at public schools, where we're no longer seeing large enrollment increases there. But for pediatric folks, it's just something to know that that's not the area where we're seeing the significant growth right now. That's being driven a lot by that sort of aging of those older cohorts right now. And if we sort of look at what the projections are and convert them back to that original graph that I had and say, well, we already looked at what the last 10 years look like, let's look at the forecast for the next 10 years, we see almost a flip of the narrative. So our population growth is projected to be 24%. So Portland State almost copy-pasted the last 10 years for the next 10 years. That's a lazy way to do forecasting, I'll tell you that. That's what their forecast is for the next 10 years. The Oregon Employment Department does the employment projections. Over the same period of time, they're projecting 15% growth in health jobs. Do you remember what it was over the last 10 years? 50%. 50. So this is a huge slowdown in health jobs. Basically, I think the idea there is that like combination of slower population growth and that some of this buildup to meet the need of boomers aging has been happening like as we speak. And so we're sort of, that's sort of baked in a lot of that buildup and growth is where the projection's coming from. And then the economy as a whole in Central Oregon is supposed to grow by 11%, which would be the slowest 10-year growth rate that we've had in probably 40 years, if that's true. And so it's, yeah, we'll see. Some competition that's happening right here. But I think long-term, for our conversation today, is to be encouraged by a few things. Be encouraged by the demographics are in the favor of healthcare right now, for sure, big time. We are bucking the national and statewide trend where we are continuing to see growth. Most communities in Oregon right now are seeing significant decline. So we are a growth community still. Our youth population numbers looked bad, right? They were flat. Most communities' youth population numbers are actually moving in the opposite. They're going down. So we're stable in that area. And so when it comes to a non-discretionary industry like healthcare, unless you're doing, Botox or something, it is a pretty encouraging time to be in this particular industry, which I don't give a lot of talks to a lot of industry groups where I get to be so positive. So this is positive economist speak, even though something might have looked negative there. So let's transition to the conversation so we can hear sort of a little bit more about the industry conversation. Thank you. You guys have mics, right?
Yeah, I just speak loudly.
Oh.
I can speak loudly too, so we can all speak loudly. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Awesome. That was really good discussion. I appreciate that insight. I feel like that kind of gave us an idea of where we're headed, and hopefully that helps you a little bit with your businesses and kind of the demographics that you're going to see coming into your offices. So really appreciate that insight. So we're going to start out, we've got some general questions and then we got some specific questions for each panelist. So we'll start out with the general one. And again, feel free if you have something that pops up in your head and you want to ask a question if we haven't gotten to it yet, definitely ask. So first question, I guess we'll just start at the end. As you support private practice owners and business owners in general, how has your role changed the most in the past 5 years? And what changes, if any, do you anticipate in the next 5 to 10 years? So
that's me.
You go.
I wasn't sure. Well, it depends on which part of healthcare you're talking about. If you look at dentistry, there's been a lot of roll-ups, a lot of things going to DSO groups, group practices forming, coming together. But you're also seeing a little bit different parts on the healthcare side of it, the medical professions. A lot of those folks are actually coming back out of the hospital systems, forming their own group practices and doing it that way. Because I think a lot of them got tired of working with the big government, or excuse me, the big hospital systems and some of the big insurance companies. So there's kind of been a dual transition on those two.
Nice. Yeah, I think the biggest change for us is the clients being more open to a consultative approach and working with them, like a proactive approach. I like to term it as the traditional CPA model, where it's a retroactive advice, things you should have done. It's pretty much worthless at that point, right? So the proactive, ongoing approach has been very attractive to clients. Obviously, we're able to affect change in the current year and be most impactful in that way. And I think the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's growth in that space in terms of more time with clients to make impactful decisions with them that have the best effect. So, yeah.
And I'll pass, because I already talked about the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes, but for you specifically, Damon, so economically speaking, what has had the greatest impact on the healthcare industry here in Oregon, like specifically Central Oregon, that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, I didn't put any comparative statistics out there, but like it's hard to really emphasize how exceptional the growth has been. And how the private sector has responded to that growth by providing, like, meeting the needs of the population that exists here. It's, that is like the greatest graph for capitalism I've ever seen, right? Like, there is a market, and the market meets the need. Sometimes maybe not as quickly as we wish, because I don't know if anyone needs to get, a medical procedure done. Sometimes it's like, oh, there are more orthopedic surgeon's a bad example, there's plenty of them, whatever. It can be frustrating for sure, but it's been really great to see the market responding in such a way. And like I said, I think expectations for our population slowing down almost gives time for the market to catch up a little bit, because we are still a little bit behind there. And so that slower growth rate is probably, a little bit off. I think we have to do a little bit of catch up, then the 11%, 15% on top of that is going to happen. But I think most of us, generally when we're talking about the economy as a whole anyways, we're in this very boring period of the economy right now, very ho-hum, not a lot of excitement. Inflation's kind of curing itself slowly, and job growth is really slow. It seems really boring, and it's like, okay, well, some of these markets just needed time to heal, and like the boring period, that's all right. We could take a bit of boring. So if we see slightly slower growth rates from our population over the next decade in Central Oregon, that's probably really great for the health sector to say, like, okay, we can play a little bit of catch up here to get ahead of this now.
Perfect. Thank you. So we'll start with you, Jordan. This is more CPA
You're not
banking.
gonna ask me economics questions.
Yes. So what is the biggest healthcare industry challenge private practices are up against at the moment? Like, are you seeing trends among private practices right now? Like, what's the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I feel like staffing has been really hard, right? I mean, like the Great Recession, that was a big trend, but it's kind of had some trickle-down effect. I was at a conference last year in Nashville in like November, and there was data suggesting that people were leaving for as little as 25 cents an hour of a raise, which is about $500 a year, right? So not a huge amount. So retention is a big thing. In terms of like curating, did you guys about like trends and how they're handling that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is people focusing kind of internally on like culture, right? Making it a good place to work, an attractive place for people to work, having tie-ins, incentives to the work that they do, right? To make sure that they feel tied to the work they do and the outcome that they produce. So, yeah.
What about for you, Scott? What are
I
you seeing?
think a lot of that too is reimbursements too, and that's where you might be able to answer some questions on, because it's tough, because when they're cutting back your reimbursements continually, and you're kind of constantly fighting for that extra portion, it gets tough, because it just squeezes that bottom line. So.
Gotcha.
Have the workforce challenges been issues that other people have faced? I mean, just like a quick show of hands. You're in a safe environment, don't worry. You can be honest. Just a few? Not? Okay, I was going to say, I mean, this is something we hear in healthcare a lot. And education as well. We hear a lot of burnout too, particularly in healthcare, and some of that is that pinch point that we're talking about, where it's like, the industry's been trying to play catch up to this massive growth rate, and so the workers that are in the industry feel overburdened, and that's causing a lot of like workforce challenges in particular. So, in recruitment, I'm sure many of you had issues with recruiting workers to move to Central Oregon for a job because, sometimes their expectation for the type of housing that they can afford with the wage that they're getting doesn't meet that expectation. And we hear that a lot, particularly St. Charles talks about that quite a bit, even on some of the higher provider incomes that we see.
Yeah. Are you all seeing that same trend as well? Like getting employees and then retaining employees?
They want $30+ an hour without education.
Yeah.
And certainly you're not having people move, the housing cost is off the charts right now, right? So like you said, even at St. Charles, even with higher paid staff, even a physician is put in a position where they really can't afford good housing, right?
So it sounds like, based on what you were saying, is we're seeing this population growth, right? Especially with the aging population, the silver tsunami that's coming, but it's very difficult to get physicians over here, right? Because it's not affordable, and so it's very interesting.
Well, and not just physicians, but techs and.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting that the housing conversation is one that crosses any conversation I'm in, regardless of industry. And it always comes up and people say, well, what's the solution to this? Like, how do we solve this problem? And there's some people who want to say, like, well, let's just always incentivize affordable housing or something like that. And affordable housing is great. There's nothing wrong with affordable housing. But if we're not building all the things, then the person who would buy the highest income housing steps down and buys the next available housing that's there in that market, which then prices out the person who would have otherwise bought that. And it's this trickle-down effect. So the answer is we need to build more McMansions and more apartment complexes and more $1.2 million houses and more, all of the things to help solve some of this issue, because that otherwise we have this compression of the housing market that becomes really difficult for us to solve.
You know, it's funny, I was in Phoenix for an economic conference this week, and they said the exact same thing. Because Phoenix is very similar to this, the economy's going like crazy. And they said that that's right, they need to build more McMansions into some of those higher end houses to get people to buy those, and let the other ones trickle down.
You don't get popular in Salem when you tell people you need to build more McMansions,
Right.
but it's the truth.
So, thank you. Oh, and just like, honestly, like, feel free to if you want to get up and get more food and, you know, all this stuff. Okay, perfect. So we're going to pivot a little bit because I think this one's really interesting and a trend that we're seeing specifically with AI. So what's your take on the developments being made in AI and the effect it will have on the healthcare industry? So how does each affect?
I mean, I think it's fascinating, right? I mean, I can't remember the last conference I went to, whether it's industry conference for y'all or myself, right? Tax CPE that doesn't bring up AI. I mean, it's everywhere, right? SNL did the famous bit, I mean, it's everywhere, right? AI is everywhere. I think it's really fascinating. I went to EDCO conference in February. I don't know if some of you guys were able to attend
The
that.
ready one? Oh, no, the woman one. Yeah, the Edco, I'm sorry.
The one-
and
There was one in
the
Redmond.
one
that
at
was
the
great,
conference.
yeah.
At the River House, yeah, and there was a gentleman there, he was in the AI space for Pacific Source, and he was talking about a tool they were working on or is potentially soon to be finished, basically a WebMD on steroids. Kind of replaces like a nurse hotline in some ways. So I think the opportunity there is really fascinating on what can be leveraged. But the big thing is like the risk associated, right? And he actually shed light on, you know, there still needs to be doctor oversight on the advice that those apps and AI are giving. And it's no different than, I remember when ChatGPT was newer, there was a lawyer, you may have heard this case, when he had a complete write-up of his case done by ChatGPT. It was a very strong case in his favor. The only problem is some of the cited cases that were in there were fabricated. They were incorrect cases. And he actually got disbarred and lost his license. So very similar to your industry, to my industry, there still needs to be oversight as to the information that comes out of those tools. But I think sky's the limit in terms of some of the leverage points of that. And I'll be really interested to see how that's.
How do you feel that that's going to impact like your industry as a CPA and advisor? Like, what do you see for your own specific? How you're going to approach that?
Yeah, sure. So for us, right, I mean, there's a lot that we do that are repetitive, mundane tasks, depending on the kind of stage you are in your accounting career. And I think there are elements that can be leveraged, right, to relieve some of that manual input, manual involvement. But interesting with that, right, you're then going to have newer, younger staff that are going to need to be educated on doing the next level tasks sooner in their career. So I think there's efficiencies to be gained, but to be gained wisely and carefully to make sure that the people that are kind of being, you know, leveraged out of that particular space are able to do the next level things to continue their opportunity forward, I guess. Yeah.
What about banking? Like, do you feel like we're going to have branches, or is it going to be automated ATMs?
We'll have branches now. We
What's
will
that
have
look
branches.
like?
And you're talking the old guy up here,
I know.
AI, it's the wrong guy to talk about AI, that's for sure. But I think, just like Jordan said, what's going to happen is some of the simple, mundane tasks in which you're going to be able to get on there and just say, I need help with X, Y, and Z. And it'll figure it out. But I still think long-term for what we do, especially with the healthcare community, is the consultative approach. Just like you said, it's still going to be there for business owners. They're not going to go in to put a chat box and find out how to fix their business or help their business or get a commercial loan. They're going to want to talk to somebody. I think that's where we still add value. And we hopefully add value for everyone.
So at my core, I'm a labor and employment economist, and if we look at like the history of sort of labor issues across the U.S., going back hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years, and every time we've had a crisis of labor supply, technology has increased productivity to help us overcome those burdens of low labor supply. We are facing this demographic conundrum of boomers retiring, millennials being the next biggest generation, coming behind them, the boomers boom, and there's every generation smaller and smaller and smaller. And people are freaking out. They're like, what are we gonna do? Do we dramatically increase immigration? Yes, we should do that. We gotta do all the things. But just like history has showed us in the past, adopting productivity gains through technological advances is really part of that solution. And so the way that most labor economists perceive AI is like, if there are things that we can push off to an AI to do mundane tasks, as Jordan said, that are, routine and simple, then that means that we could be creating higher value positions so that the human beings are doing higher and better work, more important work. That means they also get paid more for the work that they're doing. And we can offload some of these onto this technology to help us alleviate this crisis and also sort of create higher standard of living for those of us who are actual workers, not bots or whatever. It seems like it's all good to me. Yeah.
So Scott, you had mentioned about being an advisor and a consultant. So this is kind of both for Jordan and Scott. So how can a bank or a CPA be that advisor or a consultant to their clients in the industry? Like, how do you do that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the big thing for us and how we operate, and I think what works well for a lot of people is the tailored personal approach, right? That it's to your specific circumstance. It's specific to the needs you have. And I think, in an ideal world, you're meeting with your CPA on a regular basis, right? To get updates as to current circumstances, whether it be changes in regulation that have an impact on you or opportunities relative to your practice or personal circumstance. I also think benchmarking is huge, right? You're a data geek, if that's okay to say. I also love looking at data with my clients. I mean, trend analysis is one that's obvious, right? Historical trends, what's happening for you, what are causes associated with that, perhaps. But also, I'm a competitive person. I know a lot of people are as well. I love to see how you match up to your peers, right? Relative to your specific, specialty area. Like, how do you compare to other anesthesiologists or whatever it is that you do? I think that's hugely insightful to see areas maybe where you're overperforming or underperforming, so you can make those adjustments on the fly. And I also think, obviously the advisor role and the consultative approach, kind of have a longer term view. It's not just a compliance relationship. We're not just filing a tax return, hey, see you next year. It's more like we want to see you get to meet your goals, whether it's your 5-year, 10-year goals or retirement goals, however far out there might be. So I think that's how that plays out for us.
You should be in banking.
Oh, yeah.
You took my answer.
Ditto. That's what
No,
we
but
do.
more on top of that, though, I mean, it's part of it. The most successful practices and groups I've been around, they survive themselves with good CPAs, a good attorney, and a good banker. And it's played, I've been doing this for over 20-something years, and the most successful groups are the ones that do surround themselves with good people. So.
Perfect. All right, so before I ask Scott, the elephant in the room about where rates are going, because we all want to know. Does anybody have a particular question for the banker or CPA or the economist that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I have a question.
That seems like a joke, by the way. Just like, you get a bank, you get an economist in a room.
They don't know anything.
I'm sure we'll come up with a joke, yeah.
Sorry, Sam.
When you were talking, Damon, about technology helping us get over humps of labor crises, and I think back to 100 years ago when the standard, I don't know, maybe longer, standard work week was 6 days a week. I think I'm a little bit surprised that we have not moved away from that 40-hour week that we've had for over 100 years. And I wonder if you see that happening at all. And obviously in service industries and accountants and banking and that maybe that's different, but kind of the general philosophy around a 40-hour work week.
Yeah, from a policy front, there's been a lot of efforts over the last 10 years or so. That's actually kind of been like a sexy topic that at the federal level, some legislators have tried to tackle. I don't think that would be the successful route to approach it. And even though that was the successful route of getting the 40-hour work week, like that was a major legislative success that radically transformed what it meant to be a worker in the United States. It seems like we are moving to a point where like the work will be done as it is needed, and adults are treated as adults and get the work done. And this concept of maybe it's 30 hours a week this week, maybe it's 60 next week, but like as the business needs, the work hours ebb and flow with that is sort of where we're transitioning to a little bit. And we actually see that in the productivity stats, the macro level. Productivity is measured simply by the amount of GDP, gross domestic product, the output of the economy relative to the number of hours worked. And we see really fascinating trends in that, where like productivity in Oregon has skyrocketed over the last like 4 years. And most of that is actually because the hours worked has gone down, but our GDP has gone up. And so we might actually be in a world where we're moving away from the 40-hour week organically, but we're doing it with increased production. We're actually creating more value with fewer hours today, which is really impressive. So that's not a good answer for you, except to say that, like, I don't think we'll see a legislative change there, but I think that the trend in the economy is moving that way, and technology really is going to help us with that. If you know, I forget what the stat is that people always say about, you know, how much of our day we spend doing emails or something like that, like these mundane tasks. It's like, well, if I cut out 20% of my workday from this stupid thing that I do, some of that goes back to increased productivity and hours I can do in the business operation, but some of it could just go back to my quality of life, and I can go for an hour and a half bike ride on my lunch break instead of a 45-minute lunch break ride, something like that. And that's huge benefits to the employee in the long run too, right?
I'd be out of curiosity, you know, like with remote work going on, like I heard recently, like some of the practices were starting to have some of the admins ask to work remotely. Has anybody been asked that lately? Is that like a slower trend? Like, hey, can I more flexible work schedules? Yeah. How do you feel about that?
I think it depends on the role.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think some of it can absolutely be managed outside the office, and I think some of the roles are easier to track productivity than others. And I think it can be a great recruitment tool as well, as we're like facing this staffing shortage, especially for some of those positions. And with childcare being a big issue as well. So I think some of these tasks don't need to be done specifically during 9 to 5 business hours. So I think it'd be a great effective way to recruit for some of these spots. But
Yeah, and I think you bring a good point too about the child care here in Central Oregon is a really big
huge
issue.
Yeah, and the cost of it. I mean, not only the cost plus actually finding the care and getting into a facility. So I think it's a big barrier for some people moving here as well.
Yeah.
It's like you were an audience plan. It's like, okay, I was like, did you just hit all the things there? You know? I once had a supervisor years ago tell me, he's like, we can't give anyone, we can't give you special privileges. And what, you know, for like special hours or something like that. And he said, instead, we give everyone special privileges. And it was this interesting philosophy that I'll never forget. It will always stick with me. It was this idea that, like, as long as it works for the business operations, we say yes. If you need to, like, you know, pick your kid up from school early today because of something, yes. As long as it's not super disruptive or breaks the business functions, then, like, the answer is always yes. So everyone gets special privileges. And that philosophy isn't like let's all pat each other on the back and give everyone a ribbon. It's more like realizing that we're all humans and that we all have things that happen in our lives. And if someone feels sort of respected and seen in the workplace, then that really helps retention, and it also boosts productivity as well. So that's sort of, you know, those sorts of things employers have to sort of be aware of within the business function. And healthcare is a sticky one because a lot of healthcare has to happen in person. You can't have like the nurse working remotely unless they're doing like telehealth. Besides that, but like, you know, if the ED, you know, the emergency department of the hospital can't have remote nurses. Like, there needs to be a nurse there to see them. But within the business function, like, you know, do what we can so that everyone can have special privileges. So it was just a great philosophy. I loved it.
Interesting. I do have to say, Dana's wife used to be a nurse, so he knows a lot about healthcare. She works for St. Charles, so he definitely on the healthcare space. Interesting, like, you know, going to some of these chamber events, you know, trying to talk about the shift in like the daycare. As employers, have you thought about putting like a subsidized daycare in your facilities for your employees? Has that been something that's, you know, just trying to think of ways with that?
Can I comment on that?
Yes.
So,
because I know someone who did that.
yeah. So Matt and I, we're from the Veterinary Referral Center in Central Oregon. And we have, we just opened up a new facility. We have about 120 employees or so, maybe a little more now. And for better or worse, our profession is about 90% women. And for better or worse, also, you know, for the most part, the role of childcare is still like, okay, you're the mom, like you figure it out. I'm dad. And so in our space, it's definitely it's almost like under a bigger, you know, magnifying glass. the problem of childcare, the lack of childcare. And so we, as we built this facility, we said, hey, let's carve out some space for childcare. And what we've come to realize is that it's really hard to put it together, and it's really hard to make it work. It's a challenge. And so, do we regret it? Not 1 second at all. It's not a regret at all. It has been such a cool morale booster for our staff, where you walk through and you see all these kids playing, having a great time. It just makes you feel good, And all day we're dealing with dogs that are, sick and not feeling good. It's not all puppies, and so you see kids and it's like, oh, finally I get to see some puppies almost, and they're healthy, right? And so, but the challenge is there's a lot of there's these ratios you have to abide by with childcare, and anybody that gets childcare, like they don't want to pay more for childcare than what they make it work. And so it's really challenging to hire people that want to work in childcare, and it's also really hard to make it financially sound because you're really like strapped by these ratios where you can't really, you can't scale it effectively. So it's definitely something that if you guys decide to do, go into it knowing, like from our standpoint, we went into it knowing like, if we break even, we do good, and this is more for our culture and for our people, and we're still kind of in that path to try to break even, but it's hard, and we have spots open for the community as well to try to make it work, where the idea is that community members pay, because what we do is we want our staff to pay less, right? We have our highly compensated doctors, they can pay, and then we have our staff, which aren't highly compensated, and we want to give them a break. And in order to be able to do that, our plan is to say, okay, anybody from the community pays, kind of regular price, and overall, we're giving our staff a break and making it work. So that's kind of the model we're trying to do, but it has been a really big challenge. And also, we're a little bit of a well-kept secret that the community doesn't know yet that we have childcare, and so that's what we're kind of ramping up for.
Quick question, was it the legal requirements really difficult, or is it?
It's like a big school project, and I would say like there, we had about 2 or 3 years to kind of figure this out, because that's how long it took to get our building together, and there was an extra year waiting for permits. So thankfully, it wasn't too bad, but there were some pieces and roadblocks in there, and one of the big things is making sure you build it right, build it to code. You can't just say, hey, I'm going to add childcare to my building. Like, there's so much stuff that has to go into it. You got to make sure that there's appropriate fires, exits, and you got to make sure that there's sprinklers, and so there's all this code that comes with it, and then on top of that, then the state is also going to be different. Like, for example, we have to have a fire alarm test every month for childcare. The rest of the building is just once a year, So there's all these things that we have to do that we otherwise wouldn't do. And in addition, getting to it was pretty challenging from the standpoint of, hey, that's not my wheelhouse, and I had to learn a whole bunch about ratios and a whole bunch about, kids and stuff. And, it is just a very interesting process.
Are they just less furry dogs?
Yeah, less furry dogs, yeah. They bite more, I noticed. But for the most part, like the people that were involved on the state side and the local side were actually very supportive and helpful. And so everybody was excited for us to put this together, and was very supportive. And so, so they were very good about putting up with my ignorance. Yeah. And then one of the harder parts was actually trying to get insurance actually for the childcare, because they wouldn't give us a quote until we had a director, but we hadn't hired a director because we weren't that place yet, and we're trying to figure out, well, can we please get a quote so we can figure out, how are we gonna afford this and kind of do our projections and see the math and does it work? And so that was one of the challenging parts was trying to get information on the financial planning of it and assessing the viability and what are the breaking points was a little bit challenging.
Interesting. Very cool. They also have food trucks on their lot too, which is pretty awesome. They're visionaries, I'm telling you, you need to chat with these guys. Visionaries. Okay, perfect. So we'll have it just a little bit longer. Before we get into the rate questions, I know everybody wants to know that about banking. Is there anything else on your minds going on with the industry right now? Economic outlook, anything?
I didn't talk about veterinarians.
Yeah,
but you know what?
I was about to say, can you guys say and for veterinary?
In veterinarians, but it's important to note that generally more people means more animals, and also animals eat weird things, and that means more demand for veterinary services as well. So it falls the non-discretionary trend as well.
Exactly.
Well, as far as rate goes, they're not going to go down anytime soon. The economist I saw on Monday in Phoenix, he said, at best, it'll be late fall, maybe, and then but he still thinks that maybe, and you probably want to add to this, but just because of the election cycle, they didn't want to get too wacky one way or the other, and he said there's a lot of conflicting data out there in the different reports, and so they don't know what to do, because one month they'll have a great jobs report and then a bad jobs report, and it's just coming in and so fluent right now that they just don't know what's going to happen. So, but it will be late in the year, if at all. So.
Yeah, I just had lunch with the economist of the San Francisco Fed, which was weird timing, and I never have lunch with him, so that was unusual, but a little insight. I don't know if I'm supposed to share this, but yeah, he said they're not till the end of the year, and how why that matters, or what, you know, like sometimes this like Fed policy stuff gets like wonky and people get confused. Like, what is this? We had inflation. We all remember inflation, right? That was.
It's still there, it's a thing.
It's a thing.
It's a thing.
A little bit of inflation is good. 2% to 3% is generally considered like good inflation. Less than that's bad. We don't want less than 2%. Not going to get into reasons why less than 2% is bad, but more than 2 or 3% doesn't feel good to the consumer. We also get things called like a wage price spiral, where workers are like, I'm paying more in inflation, so I need to ask for more wages, and then I ask for more wages, and the business says yes because they don't want to lose them, but then they have to increase the price of their goods and services, so we get more inflation. See how this spirals up like that. The interest rate conversation, there's only so many tools in the toolbox to do anything about inflation. And one of the tools is the federal government can stop spending, which they did dramatically. We saw one of the biggest reductions in federal spending we've ever seen over the last 2 years. A huge pivot. But on the other side, on the monetary policy side, the Federal Reserve only has one tool in their toolbox, and that's what's called the Fed fund rate. That's the rate at which banks borrow from one another. Basically, if the reason for inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods, that's sort of the lingo that you'd say for why inflation exists, then one of the ways we can make inflation go away is to make it so that we have fewer dollars out there. And so by making interest rates higher, that translates or trickles down to consumer or business loans. It means that we will spend less dollars out there buying goods and services, should make it so that the rate of increase in goods and services drops. So we care about what the Fed says, the Fed fund rate, and when they're going to drop the rate, because that will eventually trickle down to us, kind of. It's all loosely connected there. But all of this is an effort to fight inflation. So you all struggling through this high interest rate environment, you're all doing your part to fight inflation. So good job. You're doing it. That's hard to hear for businesses, though, that are looking to expand and need capital right now. And so it's a really difficult time, which translates into why Oregon has seen really mostly flat job growth over the last year, not a lot of expansion there.
Yeah. So Jordan and Scott, like, what would be your advice right now in this environment to your clients?
Well, I'll jump in really quick. Well, it's also the opportunity cost. So if you can expand your facility or build a facility and increase your production or your sales, whatever, by 30%, is that extra 1% interest rate going to make a difference to you? I mean, if you think about it, on $1 million, $10,000 a year, but if you're going to make an extra $100,000 a year in income from it, does it really make that much of a difference? So.
Add to that, the rates will come down. So there will be an opportunity to refi in the future. You're not tied to a rate. Just like with your mortgage,
It's got to be.
over 30 years, you're not going to have that. So just keep in mind that there is a lot of production going on regardless of the rate.
And we've had a lot of construction projects this year. We've really, we haven't seen any decrease in demand. So I think people are out there making those business decisions saying, you know what, yeah, my cost is a little bit more on the interest side of things, but if I know the demand's out there for these discretionary services, well, let's keep growing, so.
Yeah, I think for me, it's so facts and circumstance specific for a client. Literally, I had a conversation with a client today. She has 3 more years on a note that has a large balloon payment, and she's thinking about extending that, right, refinancing, extending it to avoid the large balloon payment, but the rate is 2% more than she's paying now. And so the kind of analysis of like, well, gosh, what are you going to be paying in the long run? Like, does it make sense to temporarily prioritize cash flow to make the balloon payment to outweigh the cost of the additional interest and the pain point there? But yeah, it's so facts and circumstances specific with clients, and advice around that. We usually just defer to y'all as bankers to offer up the right products for them, and then we do the analysis to, hey, does this product make sense at this current time? So.
Yeah, and I think, to Scott's point, like one thing, have a conversation with my clients, right, is the opportunity cost, if it's especially like here in Central Oregon, if you're looking to buy a practice and they don't go for sale very often, are you gonna give up that opportunity? You're gonna get a higher interest rate now, but leaving that opportunity on the table, you have to do, you have to do the math and figure out, okay, if I get in the practice now, I start building equity, I'll refinance in a couple years when rates go down, or, like especially here, those opportunities are few and far between lately, so definitely that balance. And again, talk to your CPA and do your break-even analysis and all that. And Eric, can I get that in writing? Because that's my credit admin for the bank about the interest rates coming down.
I don't think it'll come down until.
They're not gonna go up, that's for sure.
I think it'll be down in June.
Yeah, so we have a question?
Just out of curiosity, general diversity in the economy question here. With that large growth we've had, are there any new emerging markets, or how diverse is those jobs that we're seeing the growth in? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, Bend has been it's actually Central Oregon more broadly, but Bend more specifically, has been a really beautiful transition of this economy. We were a timber town in the 1980s that was basically shuttered. Like, it was tough times. There was not a lot going on. The industry had really cratered in the 1960s and was just on like survival mode for 20 plus years. Then a bit of a nail in the coffin in the early 1990s. And tourism, as much as locals love to hate on it, sort of opened folks' eyes across the country and across the greater Pacific Northwest of the quality of life that we all have here. And that made people say like, hey, I would love to live there. And that sort of like, I would love to live there, this sort of second paycheck is what we call it in economic speak, sort of brought, people were like, well, there's not a lot going on in the economy. So they brought jobs with them. They brought an entrepreneur environment. They brought their own businesses. And we had this, it seems slow, but for an economic transition, a rapid transition of our economy. And everyone sort of says, well, we moved from timber to tourism. That's sort of the lingo that you'll hear a lot. And it's just great because there's an alliteration there, and we love alliterations. But really, we had sort of this timber to tourism, and but that pivot was really important in tourism to then bring forth this rapid diversification that we've seen. And thank God it happened too, because of the cost of living. Like, it has spurred far higher wage jobs than the region ever had before, and able to afford the cost of living a little bit better as well. But it's been really impressive to see that sort of growth there. Mostly in the we call the sort of professional technical sector is where we see that, which includes CPAs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice segue. I don't have anything to add on the economic front, but yeah, nice segue. Well done.
If you have a burning question that you'd like to know, please somebody have a really hard one. I want to see these guys squirm.
I'll ask something. So I went to an ECHO event, I guess the big annual talk. I think it was like a year or two ago, I think. And he was an economist, and he said that in 2030 there's going to be a great recession.
That guy, yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be a great recession. We're going to go to war with China, and get ready. Things are good now, but they're not going to be in 2030. And I'm just curious if you guys were there. It sounds like you were there.
Was that you?
Yeah, I remember that
Was
discussion.
that you, David? Were you?
No, I was,
Distinct. Yeah.
And it was really, I mean, it was really entertaining, really fun to listen to him. And
It's
you know,
2024 though now.
Yeah.
It's like,
Great, crap.
But from my standpoint, you know, 6 years down the line, you know, how long am I going to be doing what I'm doing? And if I'm thinking, okay, at what point are we going to exit? You know, and I'm wondering if other people are in the same boat where they're like, okay, you know, I'm thinking like I'm going to continue to do this for another 6 to 10 years tops. You know, does that mean I should hurry up and think about my exit sooner because you guys believe this is going to happen and I should get out while I can? Or hey, don't worry, ride the recession. It'll be, you know, rainbows and sunshine after a couple of years.
No, well, okay, so that guy, he's a known doomer. He's very entertaining. Very entertaining. I think I'm pretty entertaining, and I'm an optimist. So, you know, we don't have to be doomers to be entertaining. His whole premise on that forecast of this like massive, I mean, he frames it as a depression greater than the Great Depression, which has no context for any of us since none of us lived through that. So it's always just like nice lip service, but no application that we can relate to, is based on the silver tsunami concept. It's the demographic shift. It's saying this huge demographic of boomers aging out. And he's saying once they've aged out, you know what I'm saying there? Economists don't like to say dying, but that's what we mean when we say aging out. That they're no longer spending their money in the economy. So what happens when this huge chunk of people aren't spending that revenue or their income in the economy, and we have progressively smaller and smaller demographic groups, that you have this moment where like spending dries up, demand for goods and services dries up, and it causes this economic catastrophe. He's not wrong on the demographics at all. It's all true. That's going to be how it goes. How that would translate to a massive depression is still a head scratcher because everyone doesn't age out at once. Turns out we don't coordinate these things. That would be uncomfortable. And genocide, I don't know. So that's not a thing. So he's wrong in the timing. And like a gradual trickle like that is not going to cause a big catastrophe for the most part. But yeah, like there's a complete realistic future where we see decades of no growth. Or modest declines, you know. Housing is a good example. I often want to tell the millennials in the room, your parents maybe bought a house thinking it was a retirement investment. If you were a millennial, do not buy a house as a retirement investment. There's going to be a glut of housing on the market 15 years from now. Buy a house because you love the house and you want to live in the house, and it's your home. Don't buy it because it's some sort of leverage for some future thing. Because when all these folks age out, then we have smaller demographic groups behind them. We have a housing supply boom. That's great. So it's going to be good for affordability, though, which we're complaining about the opposite right now. But either way, yeah, the doomer stuff, I would ignore that.
Just to touch on the one comment you made about if you were going to exit, usually two to three years out, you want to start having those discussions and exploring what that looks like. I mean, veterinarians right now, there's a huge trend in private equity entering that space. I'm sure you're aware of that. My only caution on that is make sure you have a good business lawyer to vet the contract. There was a client I worked with who was down in the San Francisco area, had a quite lucrative on paper offer from private equity. He was an endodontist. We looked it over for the tax impact. We said, no, this is not great. Had a lot of rollover equity units. The true, it represented as like a 7x multiplier. I mean, it looked huge for him, but it was all in the form of rollover equity primarily. So the actual cash he was going to net was not great. We actually advised him against it, and he calls us 4 months later and says, well, I'm so excited I sold practice. And we're like, this is horrible. And the ironic thing is like a few months after the deal closed, we had done tax projections illustrating to him the outcome for him. And then he got his first paycheck. He stayed around for a 5-year overlap for the transition. He got his first paycheck and says, how come the paycheck's so small? I don't understand. There are all these taxes coming out. It's like, yeah, we tried telling you it's going to be a bad experience. But yeah, overall, that's the general advice, is start talking about it, considering it, having those discussions 2 or 3 years out if you get to that place. But don't do it because the doomer.
Yeah, not because of the doomer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Perfect. So maybe one final question to kind of tie into that and wrap it up is, what are things that practice owners can really think about? What is some good advice do you think for practice owners that they should be considering right now with everything going on?
You're talking to me?
Anyone?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, I'm big on the holistic approach, right? You know, how is your kind of a gut check, how's your culture, right? How do you feel the short-term, long-term trend of your practices? Are you looking at attracting new providers? Is there things you need to do to make them more attracted to your practice specifically? I think the biggest thing, I know Scott had mentioned it earlier, one of the common questions I get from practitioners is why am I not making more money? Like, what's going on here? And there's a few things that play into that, of course. I think one of the top level things Scott had mentioned, right, is when's the last time you negotiated your insurance contracts, right? Maybe the patients you're serving, right, are squeezing you out via the insurance they carry, right, not the patients themselves. I had a call this morning with a client of mine, and they had mentioned a Medicare circumstance, or a dermatologist, and the code they used was for $299 was the billing code they used, and the Medicare adjustment was all the way down to $49 that they netted. And they said, gosh, well, half my practice, literally 50% of my patients is Medicare, Medicaid. And I said, well, is there an opportunity to open up, you know, time on the schedule for other patients, right? To make sure that you're maximizing the patients you serve. But to go with that, we also always have a discussion with clients on, you know, what's your scheduling like? Is it possible that you're having too long of appointments? Is there an opportunity for you to see more patients in a day, you know, that you're able to help more people, but also, right, serve more patients and have more billings and collections overall. And then I think kind of coupled with that is you should be doing benchmarking. You should be comparing yourself to your peers, year-over-year trends of your own circumstance. You know, usually those COVID years are kind of anomalies that we don't usually compare a ton to, but there is still, you know, kind of interesting information to come from those. So those are my three main encouragements for you there. And then prioritize people as best you can. So, yeah.
I just surround yourself with experts, and I think that's the biggest thing you can do. And with that, there's a lot of consultants out there. Be careful and just do your research, ask around, talk to your friends, make sure if you are going to get a consultant that they're one that really truly going to help you. But again, a good CPA, a good attorney, a good banker, you get those three cores, you'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, the only sort of, you know, positive thing I think I could leave you all with is just like, you know, a lot of different industries would be envious of sort of the tailwinds that healthcare generally has right now. Because of sort of this baked-in demographic thing, it's sort of a guarantee. Most businesses and industries don't have sort of this guarantee that's sitting behind there, and we have on top of some of the demographic advantages or some of those demographic tailwinds, living in a community that is an attractive place that will continue to have a really high second paycheck and that will bring people here. So I'm pretty encouraged for the long-term prospect for healthcare, so don't worry.
Hey, thanks for moderating.
Thank
Well done.
Any last questions? Any last questions? Burning? What? Eric?
Can the banker talk about PE 10, 5, and now?
That's hard. I mean, because if you look at, like you said, the private equity market, it's all over the map. Right now, it's still high. I mean, sometimes you sell 8 times EBITDA, up to 12 times, depending on what your practice is like. Again, this is mostly dental right now. Veterinarians are very high. Some of the big groups out there are crazy multiples out there right now. But again, it's the cost of doing it. Like you said, if you get into it, you might have to work there 5 years, and they're paying for that second rollover PE part, which may or may never happen. There hasn't been a whole lot of them that have happened, so be careful.
Yeah, and I would say like we've definitely seen a shift in the industry. Like we saw a lot, I think you mentioned it earlier, Scott, go, you know, that private equity, and then they're like, oh shoot, you know, now I'm gonna go back to owning my own practice, right? Like I wanna be my manager. So definitely, yeah, run the numbers and talk to your CPA, because we've seen anonymous scenarios on our side too. It might look really good up front, but might not necessarily pencil long term.
I literally had a client in Ohio last year who sold his practice, worked for the man, you know, worked for their new kind of boss, if you will. Hated it so much, mainly the changes they made, that I kid you not, by November of that year, I said, I'm buying your practice back. I was like, okay, so yes, vet it out, for sure. You don't want to try to buy your practice back after you inflated the cost a little bit.
You know, for a lot of providers, the big piece of equity in their practice is the real estate. And with cap rates up and interest rates up, and you know, it's a different environment than it was 18 months ago to sell a practice. Are you advising practitioners or groups to hold on to their real estate, and how long do you foresee that they'll need to hang on to it?
You talk about the rate front, I know on the CPA, it depends on the factors of like who all owns the building, the recency of the purchase relative to perhaps gaining you recapture on that, but could be a very beautiful passive income flow to you in retirement. There's a lot of factors to be considered there, but yeah, there's some circumstances where it's a no-brainer to keep it, and others where it makes much more sense to unload the property.
And a lot of times the PE firms, they don't want the real estate, so it's hard to sell it anyway. But I suggest keeping it because typically, like say if you're, I'm not sure how many dentists are here, but if you sell like the Heartland, you're going to have pretty much a client, a renter for you for a long time, no matter how long you want that practice. So you're going to have a good tenant in there.
Yeah, and I think the thing too, we've seen rents going up, right? So it's like you own the building versus, just paying lease. At least you're making equity in it, right? If you, go ahead and buy the building, at least you're the owner and have equity versus paying rent to somebody else. We've seen, I think Scott mentioned it, on the banking side, we've seen a lot of tenant improvements going on where they're currently in their building and they can't quite, afford to go elsewhere, but they're going to build out their current space or buy it from the landlord. So you've seen a lot of real estate lately, a lot less practice acquisitions, I would say, but a lot more on the real estate, the tenant improvement side, which has been an interesting shift, I think.
Sorry, real quick, locally, do you think the increases in SDC costs will decrease healthcare build-outs?
Ooh. Thank you. That's a great question.
Or practices staying in their current building because the cost of construction and labor and materials and SDCs are so much higher?
Do you see that as that much of a factor that your guys' clients?
As
a factor that they weigh, is that SECs?
I haven't seen that big of an impact on it. That's locally, but different parts of the country, it does become a factor actually. So.
I think that's more of a factor on the residential side.
Yeah.
Like improvements on SDCs can make the affordability of a house dramatically better. On the commercial side, I haven't seen a lot of examples where that's been used as like a major source of like encouraging economic development through that on the commercial side. Not to say it can't, but that's just not the story we typically hear. It's mostly on housing affordability, but which is also good for everyone generally. But yeah.
No, great question. Yeah, I feel we recently did a helped a client down in Medford, and that's where we ran into an issue with the SDCs on the build out down there. So I wonder if it's city specific too, depending on where you are.